The gavel cracked, but it was the clink of chains that quieted the room. Marcus Hill and his younger brother, Daniel, sat at the defense table with their wrists linked in steel, shoulders squared the way the Corps had trained into their bones. The fluorescent lights made the cuffs flash every time they breathed. Across the aisle, Officer Brad Whitaker lounged in the first row like a man at a matinee, one arm slung over the bench, the hint of a grin playing at the corner of his mouth. Judge Harold Denton peered down from the bench without meeting the brothers' eyes. His tone came sandpaper dry. "Counselors, proceed." He didn't ask if the cuffs were necessary. He didn't ask if the defendant's 2 Marines with ribbons anyone could read were a flight risk. He just moved the day along like a foreman pushing a tired assembly line. A murmur moved through the gallery, shoes scuffing, jackets adjusting, the soft cough of people trying to look like they weren't watching too hard. Linda Hill, gray at the temples and straight-backed from a lifetime of carrying other people's weight, sat behind her sons with both hands wrapped around a folded photograph of Marcus in dress blues. Beside her, a little girl in pink sneakers, Sophia kept her chin on the bench rail, eyes wide, as if staying very still might hold the whole room together. The prosecutor, Frank Dalton, rose with a stack of papers that had too many staples and not enough truth. "Your Honor," he began, voice smooth, "the state will show a pattern of aggressive and disorderly behavior culminating in assault on a peace officer." He glanced toward Whitaker as if checking a mirror. Whitaker's grin deepened by a degree. Marcus stared straight ahead, jaw tight enough to ache. Daniel's right hand twitched once against the chain, an old habit, the body bracing for impact. But he let the breath out slow and set his shoulders again. On Daniel's forearm, under the cuff and the courthouse glare, a lattice of burn scar ridges caught the light, pale against the brown of his skin. A story the room did not care to hear. "Objection," their attorney said, calm, measured, the way defense lawyers learn to be around judges who don't like to be reminded of rules. Denton's gavel came down. "Overruled. The state may continue." From somewhere in the jury box, a woman leaned toward her neighbor and whispered, not as quietly as she thought, "They said someone important flew in this morning." Her neighbor's brow pulled in. "Who?" A shrug. "Military. That's what I heard." Eyes slid toward the double doors at the back of the courtroom and then flicked away as if the doors might glance back. Whitaker stretched his legs and folded his hands on his stomach. He looked like a man who'd already tasted the end of the day and found it sweet. The smirk he wore wasn't loud. It didn't have to be. It was the kind of expression you put on when you believe the room belongs to you, judge, jury, and heir included. Dalton began to walk the jury through photocopied incident reports, underlined phrases, words like belligerent and non-compliant, as if repeating them might make them true. He said suspects instead of men. He said altercation instead of hands forced against a hood. He said fear for safety, like a magic spell. Marcus let the words pass over him and fixed his eyes on a point just above the prosecutor's shoulder. He'd learned a long time ago how to detach from noise. He could still hear the rhythm of rotor blades when he needed it, the clean logic of orders coming through a headset. When the chain tugged as Daniel shifted, Marcus turned his head just enough. "Breathe," he said, barely moving his mouth. Daniel did. The chain eased. "Before we continue, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and comment the country or city you're watching from. It helps us share more real stories like this one." The back left door opened, and a man in a navy suit slipped in, then closed it carefully, as if he worried sound might bruise. 2 jurors looked up. He stayed standing, scanning, then found a seat near the aisle. A second later, an older man in a worn ball cap USMC stitched in fading red stood to give his chair to a woman with a Bible clutched to her chest. She murmured, "Thank you," without meeting his eyes. The older man remained standing, hat folded against his ribs, gaze fixed on the brothers, like a man trying to remember a name he used to know. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dalton said, "you will hear from Officer Whitaker about the defendant's threatening posture. Testify to your own perceptions, not the jury's." The defense cut in. Denton didn't look up. "Overruled." A ripple of discomfort crossed the pews, the sound people make when they recognize a script and don't like the ending. In the second row, a teenager raised her phone as if to check the time and kept it there, recording at a slant. A bailiff noticed, shook his head once, and she lowered it again, cheeks flushed. Sophia reached for Linda's hand. "Grandma?" she whispered. A child's question packed with freight. No child should have to lift. Linda squeezed her fingers. "Watch your daddy sit up straight," she said softly. "That's what we do." It wasn't an answer. It was a plank in a storm. Whitaker finally stood when Dalton called his name, adjusting the line of his tie with the deliberation of a man stepping into a spotlight. He took the oath with his palm raised and his eyes already on the jury. "Officer," Dalton said, "tell us what happened the night you encountered the defendants." Whitaker tilted his head toward Marcus and Daniel, then back to the jurors. "They were agitated," he said. "Aggressive. I gave clear commands. They ignored them. For my safety, I acted." For a moment, the silence in the room wasn't quiet at all. It was a pressure, something heavy pushing down on everything soft. Daniel looked at the table, then at his brother, then at the small reflection of his own cuffed hands in the polished wood. Marcus did not blink. Denton made a note, pen scratching the pad. The clock over the door ticked with a sound too large for its size. Outside, a siren wrote a crooked line through the afternoon and faded. Someone in the gallery, no one seemed to know who, whispered, "Heard he flew in this morning, early." A second voice. "Who?" The first, "You'll know when you see him." The bailiff shifted at his post. The double doors, heavy and courthouse old, stayed shut. "Proceed," Judge Denton said. And Dalton did, stacking words where facts should have been, laying brick after brick to wall off doubt. The room behaved itself, because rooms like this teach people how. The brothers sat with their chains and their quiet, and the weight of every mile they'd marched together. Whitaker talked like a man reciting a story he'd rehearsed in his bathroom mirror. The judge listened like a man who'd already decided how this chapter ended. No one in that room, not the man with the smirk, not the man with the gavel, not the jurors who kept stealing glances at the doors. They swore they weren't watching, knew that down the hall a set of boots had already stepped off the elevator. The footsteps came slow, unhurried, each one landing with the kind of certainty you don't learn in courthouses. And when those doors finally moved, the room would forget how to breathe. But before those boots ever touched the courthouse floor, the night that started it all was still burning fresh in memory. It hadn't begun with gavels or jurors or whispers of rank. It began far from the bench, under the humming lights of a gas station on Highway 41. The pump hissed as Marcus Hill leaned against his truck, swiping his card, eyes heavy from miles on the road. Daniel shifted nearby, rolling his shoulders, duffel bag sagging at his hip. It was a small-town stop, nothing more than neon signs buzzing, moths scattering across the glass, and the smell of gasoline clinging to the air. Then the cruiser rolled in. Tires chewed the asphalt, headlights slicing across the pumps. Red and blue washed over the concrete like spilled paint. Officer Brad Whitaker stepped out slow, hand already resting on his holster, the kind of walk that told you he wasn't here to ask questions. "You two," Whitaker called, his voice sharp as broken glass. "Hands where I can see 'em." Marcus lifted one palm from the nozzle, steady, calm. "Evening, officer. We're just filling up." "Didn't ask what you were doing," Whitaker snapped. "Asked for your hands." Daniel raised his own, the duffel slipping to the ground. "Everything all right?" "IDs. Now." Marcus pulled his wallet, movements deliberate. He held the card out. Whitaker barely looked. His lip curled. "Military," he barked a laugh. "That's supposed to mean something here." A couple of customers turned from their pumps. Phones lifted, blue screens glowing against the night. Nobody stepped closer. Daniel's jaw tightened. "We just got back. We're headed home." Whitaker circled like a dog scenting weakness. "You look nervous, agitated, suspicious." "I'm tired," Daniel muttered. "Don't talk back." Whitaker shoved him hard into the hood. Metal shrieked. Daniel grunted but didn't resist. "Officer," Marcus began. "Back up." Whitaker's hand brushed the holster. "You think those medals mean a damn thing here? Out here, I decide who's guilty." The crowd leaned closer, not to help, but to watch. A man in a baseball cap chuckled. "Guess serving your country don't count much in this town." An older veteran, hair cropped, jacket faded with unit patches, shook his head. "This ain't right," he muttered. "Quiet, old man," another bystander hissed. "Don't get yourself in trouble." Whitaker yanked Daniel's arms behind him, steel closing too tight. The cuffs clinked, sharp in the night. Then he turned on Marcus. "On your knees." Marcus drew in a breath, let it out slow, and lowered himself. Not in defeat, never in defeat, but in discipline. Whitaker slapped the cuffs on like he was branding cattle. The phones caught Marcus's face. Calm eyes, steady jaw. A man who had dragged brothers out of fire overseas, now treated like a criminal at home. Whitaker shoved him upright. Both of you under arrest. Disorderly conduct. Resisting. Assault on an officer. Daniel twisted his head back. Assault? You slammed me first. Shut your mouth, Whitaker growled, pushing him toward the cruiser. A door slammed. Betrayal thickened the air. Not one hand from the crowd reached out. Not one voice rose. Just screens, recording, waiting for something viral. Whitaker tugged at his belt, smirking. Another easy night. But what he didn't know was that the night wouldn't end with him in control. What he set in motion under those buzzing neon lights was already traveling farther than he could imagine. And someone, far from Highway 41, was about to hear what he had done. But before that call reached the right ears, before boots hit courthouse tile, the story of Marcus and Daniel Hill stretched far deeper than a night under neon lights. To understand the weight of their silence in chains, you had to know the lives they carried with them, the families waiting, the battles fought, the sacrifices no one in that courtroom could see. Marcus Hill had learned to carry silence the way other men carried weight. In the courtroom, that silence looked like defiance. At home, it looked like strength. He was 32, a widower, and the father of a little girl who drew him pictures in crayon. The last one he'd taped inside his duffel before boarding the plane home, blocky letters spelling "Welcome Home, Daddy" in purple and green, a stick figure in uniform holding hands with a smaller one in a dress. In the gas station cruiser, when Whitaker tightened the cuffs, Marcus thought not of the pain in his wrists but of Sophia's handwriting, how each letter leaned too far to the left, like she was rushing to finish before recess. If you believe their sacrifices should never be forgotten, tap the like button now. It tells YouTube this is a story worth hearing. Daniel Hill, 3 years younger, carried his weight differently. Where Marcus wore quiet, Daniel wore motion, always fixing, always building. After his last deployment, he'd rebuilt their mother's porch in Savannah, hammering each plank by hand because she refused to let anyone else do it. If my knees can hold up for 70 years, Linda had teased, a porch ought to last at least that long. Daniel made sure of it. He could still smell the sawdust on his clothes when he kissed her cheek the night before the arrest. The brothers had fought shoulder to shoulder overseas, deserts and mountains and nights when the horizon burned brighter than the Sunday. Marcus still carried the memory of Afghanistan, the sound of rotor blades cutting air thick with sand, the shout of men under fire, the sudden burst when Daniel broke cover to drag a wounded corporal back to safety. He remembered Daniel's hands slick with blood, his voice steady as he said, "You're not dying here. Not today." Back home, those hands now wore steel bracelets. The irony wasn't lost on Marcus. He could still feel the burn scar on his brother's forearm, a mark from an IED that should have taken them both. That scar had been called heroic. In the courtroom, under fluorescent light, it was just another line on skin no one cared to read. Their mother, Linda, never stopped calling them her boys, though the world insisted they were men. She had worked 2 jobs through their childhood night shifts at the hospital, mornings cleaning houses to keep them clothed and fed. When Marcus enlisted, she hugged him so hard he felt her ribs. When Daniel followed 3 years later, she cried into her hands, knowing pride and fear often rode together. Sophia, too young to remember the sand, only knew the empty chair at her school recital. When Marcus called on video, she'd leaned so close to the screen her nose smudged it. "When are you coming home for real?" she'd ask, every time. And every time Marcus swallowed the lump in his throat before answering, "Soon, baby girl, soon." The crowd at the gas station hadn't seen those lives. They hadn't seen Sophia's sign or Linda's porch or Daniel pulling a bleeding corporal through dust. They saw 2 men under neon lights, labeled suspicious, shackled because Whitaker's word weighed more than their years of service. The cruelty wasn't just the cuffs. It was the erasure, the ease with which sacrifice turned invisible in the glare of one man's authority. Marcus shifted in his chair at the defense table, the memory running parallel with the courtroom walls. He glanced at Daniel, who stared forward, jaw tight, shoulders squared as if standing inspection. Chains rattled when he moved, small sounds that should have meant nothing, but to Linda they rang louder than artillery. She pressed Sophia's crayon, drawing tighter in her lap, knuckles white. The jurors didn't know the Hill brothers. Not really. They didn't know the porch in Savannah, or the fire in Afghanistan, or the little girl who drew crooked letters in purple and green. But they would, because someone else in this town already knew, and his footsteps were drawing closer. At the station, fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, the kind that made everything look gray and tired. Officer Brad Whitaker didn't look tired. He looked satisfied. He dropped a stack of papers on his desk, leaned back in his chair, and stretched like a man who thought the night had gone exactly as planned. "Couple of loudmouth Marines off the streets," he said, grinning at no one in particular. "That's called keeping the peace." Another officer at the desk across from him shifted uncomfortably, eyes on the paperwork in front of him. He didn't answer. Whitaker chuckled. "What?" Whitaker asked. "Don't give me that look. You saw how they were acting. Aggressive, dangerous, could have gone south quick." The younger officer cleared his throat but kept his gaze down. "Didn't seem like..." Whitaker's grin sharpened. "Didn't seem like what? You questioning my call?" "Silence. That's what I thought," Whitaker said, tapping the papers with his pen. "Doesn't matter if they've got medals or war stories. Out here, I own the law. They're nothing but nobodies without that uniform." He scribbled fast, stacking charge after charge like bricks in a wall. Disorderly conduct, resisting arrest, assaulting an officer. Each word cut from air, not truth. He underlined them twice, as if bold ink could make them real. Across the room, a sergeant walked in, pausing when he caught sight of the report. "You sure about all this, Whitaker?" he asked, voice low. Whitaker didn't even look up. "I'm sure about what I saw. That's all that matters. My word against theirs, and around here my word wins." The sergeant frowned, but he didn't push. He just walked past, lips pressed thin. Whitaker leaned back again, laced his fingers behind his head, and let out a satisfied sigh. By the time the jury hears this, those two will be yesterday's news, stripped of their dignity, their service, everything. Just another couple of guys who couldn't keep their mouths shut. He laughed at his own line, loud in the quiet station. Prosecutor Frank Dalton stepped in, his briefcase in hand. He and Whitaker traded a look, something like understanding. "Got your reports," Dalton said. "That'll be more than enough." "Of course it will," Whitaker replied. "This is an open and shut case. They'll walk in with chains, and they'll walk out nobodies." Dalton smirked. "As long as the jury buys it." Whitaker slapped the papers with the flat of his hand. "They'll buy it. They always do." He gathered the stack, squared it against the desk, and exhaled like a man who had just won a prize. Outside, rain began to tap against the windows, faint but steady, as if the world itself disapproved. But inside, Whitaker grinned wider, convinced he'd written the ending already. What he didn't know was that every lie he scrawled, every charge he stacked, was another nail hammered into his own coffin. And someone powerful was already moving closer to make sure of it. The jail smelled of bleach and stale coffee. Linda Hill sat on a hard plastic chair in the lobby, her hands wrapped around a framed photo of Marcus in his dress blues. The glass was cracked from years of moving, but she polished it every week, the way some people polished silver. Now she held it like a shield, as if it could keep her boys safe behind the walls that had swallowed them. Beside her, Sophia swung her legs back and forth, pink sneakers scuffing the floor. The little girl's eyes kept darting to the double doors that led deeper into the building. "Grandma," she whispered. "When's Daddy coming home?" Linda's throat tightened. She had no answer. She squeezed the girl's hand instead, eyes fixed on the doors that stayed shut. On the other side of the lobby, Daniel's high school sweetheart, Emily Carter, leaned against the wall. Her arms were crossed tight, but her chin was up. She'd been to every hearing, every visit, never missing a chance to be near Daniel, even if the only thing between them was glass and a telephone. When reporters outside the courthouse asked why she stayed, she didn't hesitate. "Because I know who he is," she told them, "and I'll wait as long as it takes." The town didn't know what to do with the story. Some people whispered support in grocery store aisles, slipping Linda notes of prayer. Others crossed the street, muttering, if they were arrested, they must have done something. The courthouse steps became a theater. Cameras gathered, microphones thrust at anyone with Hill blood in their veins. A reporter asked Emily, "Do you think justice will be served?" She looked straight into the lens, eyes burning. Justice doesn't serve itself, it has to be fought for. Do you agree with Emily? Comment, justice must be fought for below, and let's see how many people stand with these Marines. Inside, Marcus sat in a holding cell with Daniel. The air was thick with the smell of iron and sweat. Daniel's fists clenched on his knees, knuckles pale. "They're treating us like criminals," he muttered. Marcus put a hand on his brother's shoulder. "We've been in worse places." Daniel shook his head. "Worse enemies, maybe, but not like this. This is home." Through the narrow window, Marcus could just see the courthouse dome. He thought of Sophia's drawing folded in his duffel, of Linda waiting in the lobby, of Emily's defiant voice. He thought of the service stripes on his sleeve, each one a year of his life, and how quickly a single man's arrogance had tried to erase them. But arrogance couldn't erase truth, not forever, and while their families carried the weight of waiting, someone else had already landed at Hartsfield-Jackson Airport, someone who knew exactly who Marcus and Daniel Hill were, and who would not let their names be forgotten. The courthouse smelled of varnish and old paper. Like every decision ever made, there still lingered in the air. Morning light angled through tall windows, casting bars of shadow across the floor as if the room itself believed in cages. Judge Harold Denton sat high on the bench, his face carved in stone. He barely glanced at Marcus and Daniel when the bailiff led them in, chains clinking with each step. To Denton, they weren't Marines or brothers, they were docket numbers. The prosecutor, Frank Dalton, rose with his stack of reports. He carried them like trophies, each page a weapon. "Your Honor," he began smoothly, "the state intends to prove the defendants were combative, disorderly, and aggressive toward law enforcement." He let the words hang, heavy and false. Marcus sat tall, shoulders back, eyes forward. Daniel kept his jaw tight, though his fists flexed against the cuffs. Behind them, Linda gripped Sophia's drawing so hard the paper crumpled. Emily sat beside her, lips pressed thin, her eyes locked on the jury. Dalton called Whitaker to the stand. The officer walked with a swagger, adjusting his belt before taking the oath. His smirk was subtle, but it was there the confidence of a man who believed the system belonged to him. "Tell us what happened," Dalton said. Whitaker leaned into the microphone. "The defendants refused commands. They were hostile. I feared for my safety." Marcus's attorney rose. "Objection, Your Honor. Subjective language." Denton didn't even look up. "Overruled. Proceed." Whitaker continued, each sentence rehearsed. "One of them made a threatening move. The other shouted at me. I had no choice but to place them under arrest." "Threatening move?" the defense pressed. "Can you specify?" Whitaker shrugged, spreading his hands. "It happened fast. I know what I saw." Dalton nodded, as if the vagueness were gospel. The jury scribbled notes. Marcus's lawyer stood again. "Your Honor, I must remind the court that my clients are decorated Marines with spotless service records." Denton's gavel slammed. "Counselor," I said, "proceed. Do not waste this court's time with irrelevant details." Gasps rippled from the gallery. Sophia flinched at the sound, clinging to Linda's arm. Emily shook her head, disbelief tightening her jaw. Whitaker glanced back toward the family, his smirk widening just enough. Then he leaned toward the jury, lowering his voice like a confidant. "Men like that," he said, nodding at Marcus and Daniel. "They think they're above the law, but no one is above the law." The words landed like stones. The defense tried again, pointing out contradictions in Whitaker's timeline. But Denton cut them off, snapping, "Enough. We've heard enough of these games. The state may continue." Every objection was swatted down. Every fact was drowned in the tide of Whitaker's lies. It wasn't a trial, it was theater, and the script had been written by arrogance. But arrogance is never the final author. Because even as Dalton stacked his papers and Whitaker basked in the weight of his own words, footsteps were echoing closer. Steady, deliberate, each one carrying the authority of a man who'd seen more than a courthouse ever could. And when those doors opened, the script Whitaker wrote would burn to ash. The courtroom droned with the monotony of Dalton's questions and Whitaker's polished lies. But underneath the routine there was a pressure, a sense that something was about to break. Even the jurors, scribbling dutiful notes, kept darting glances at the back of the room as if waiting for a cue they couldn't name. Marcus sat still, his silence carved from discipline. Daniel's jaw was set, but his eyes flicked once toward the gallery, toward Sophia's little sneakers swinging above the floor. Linda squeezed her granddaughter's hand so tightly that Sophia winced, though she didn't complain. She had learned, in her 7 short years, that sometimes grown-ups hold on like they're the ones about to drown. Judge Denton adjusted his glasses, impatient. "Mr. Dalton, proceed." Dalton flipped a page with unnecessary flair. "Officer Whitaker, in your professional opinion, were these men a danger to the public?" Whitaker leaned forward, his smirk practiced. "Absolutely. Men like that think they can—" The words died in his throat. The double doors at the back of the courtroom groaned open. Every head turned. A man stepped inside, tall, broad-shouldered, his uniform pressed to razor edges. Silver stars gleamed across his chest, the kind of medals jurors had only ever seen in history books or documentaries. A deep scar traced his jaw, not ugly but etched with the permanence of survival. The bailiff straightened unconsciously. 2 jurors froze mid-note. Dalton's voice faltered. Whitaker blinked, smirk thinning like smoke caught in a draft. General Robert Iron Caldwell walked down the aisle with the kind of certainty no courthouse could grant. His boots struck the floor steady, deliberate, each step commanding silence. He didn't rush, didn't glance around, didn't need to. The room bent around his presence the way trees bend to a strong wind. Linda's breath caught in her throat. Emily whispered, "Oh my God." Even Sophia sat up straighter, though she didn't know why, only that something monumental had changed. Caldwell stopped near the front row, turned, and fixed his gaze on the bench. For a long moment he didn't speak. He didn't have to. The silence itself was louder than Dalton's theatrics, louder than Whitaker's lies, louder than the gavel Denton gripped in his hand. Marcus's lips pressed together, almost into something like a smile. Daniel exhaled, tension loosening in his shoulders for the first time since the gas station. Whitaker cleared his throat, trying to recover. Your Honor, I don't see what—" Caldwell's eyes cut to him. One look, no words. And Whitaker's mouth closed on its own, like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. The jurors didn't write. The gallery didn't breathe. Even Denton shifted in his chair, the gavel suddenly too small in his grip. If you've been waiting for justice to walk in, this is the moment. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss stories where truth finally wins. And in that instant, the balance of power shifted. General Robert Iron Caldwell didn't ask permission to speak. He didn't clear his throat or wait for the judge's nod. He stepped forward, boots clicking once on the polished floor, and his voice rolled through the chamber with the weight of command. "These men," he said, gesturing toward Marcus and Daniel, "are my Marines, decorated, tested, proven, and you dare to put them in chains." Every syllable cut through the air. The jurors leaned forward. The gallery murmured. Judge Denton slammed his gavel. "General, this is highly irregular. You will—" Caldwell's gaze locked on him. "What's irregular, Your Honor, is watching combat veterans treated like criminals while liars wear smirks and call it justice." The room froze. Denton's gavel hovered but didn't fall again. Whitaker shifted in his chair, face flushing. He forced a laugh. "With all due respect, General, this isn't your battlefield. These men broke the law. I did my job." Caldwell turned slowly, his stare pinning Whitaker to the witness stand. "Your job is to protect and serve, not humiliate and fabricate." He took a step closer, his medals catching the light. "Do you know how many tours these men served? How many lives they saved while you wrote parking tickets and harassed citizens?" Whitaker's mouth opened, then closed. His usual grin wouldn't come. Dalton tried to intervene. "General Caldwell, the court has procedures." "Procedures?" Caldwell's voice thundered. "Procedures that silence truth and elevate lies? Procedures that strip honor from those who bled for this country?" Even the bailiff stood straighter, eyes fixed on Caldwell as if he, too, awaited orders. Daniel lifted his head, shoulders squaring. Marcus's eyes shone not with tears, but with the quiet recognition of a man finally seen. Caldwell pointed a steady finger at Whitaker. "I know your record, officer. The complaints buried, the abuse ignored. You think rank and medals don't matter? You're right. What matters is character, and yours is bankrupt." A ripple swept through the gallery. One juror set her pen down. Another leaned back, arms crossed, studying Whitaker with new eyes. Whitaker stammered, This is outrageous. He has no right." Caldwell's voice dropped low. "Dangerous. You had no right to put my Marines in chains." The silence that followed was suffocating. The only sound was the faint creak of the wooden pews as people shifted, caught between disbelief and awe. Linda Hill pressed a hand to her mouth. Sophia's small fingers clutched the crumpled drawing in her lap. Emily whispered, "He's turning the whole room." Caldwell stepped back, folding his hands behind him, calm once more. "I will present this court with the truth, and when I do, there will be no smirks left, only accountability." His words didn't need echo. The weight of them stayed heavy, daring anyone to challenge. For the first time since the trial began, Whitaker wasn't smiling, and the room knew the storm had only just begun. General Caldwell reached into the leather folder he carried under one arm. He laid it flat on the prosecution's table with the precision of a man placing evidence on a battlefield. The sound echoed, small but commanding. "These," he said, sliding out the first document, "are after-action reports. Marcus Hill, Daniel Hill. 2 tours in Afghanistan, 1 in Iraq, silver stars, commendations for valor. Marcus carried a wounded sergeant half a mile under fire while Daniel laid suppressive cover with his own weapon jammed and his arm bleeding. The men in this room wear suits and robes. These men wore scars so others could come home." He turned, holding the page high enough for the jury to see the official header, the signatures at the bottom. "Heroes," Caldwell said plainly. "And you chained them." The jury stirred. One woman's eyes glistened. Another man pressed his lips tight, tapping his pen against the table as if steadying his hand. Whitaker tried to laugh, brittle. "That doesn't change what they did at the gas station." Caldwell's next page hit the table harder. "And this is your record, Officer Whitaker. Internal affairs complaints, excessive force, profiling, abuse of authority. Each one buried under paperwork, each one ignored, because men like you count on silence." A hush swept the room. The sound of paper turning carried like a gunshot. Judge Denton shifted, his gavel halfway raised. "General, this court," Caldwell cut him off, "is hearing the truth for the first time today. You can gavel all you want, Your Honor, but truth doesn't stop for wood and brass." The gallery erupted in murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. A juror leaned back in his chair, studying Whitaker as if seeing him for the first time. Whitaker's face blanched. Sweat gathered at his collar. "Lies," he muttered. "All lies." Caldwell fixed him with a stare sharp enough to cut steel. "The difference between you and my Marines is simple. Their courage is written in blood. Yours is written in complaints." The line cracked through the courtroom like lightning. Dalton shuffled his papers, searching for footing that wasn't there. "Objection," he barked, voice too loud, too desperate. "Overruled," a juror whispered under his breath, drawing a laugh from the gallery. Denton's gavel slammed, but the sound was hollow. The authority had shifted, and everyone felt it. Finally, Caldwell stepped back, voice quieter now, but no less commanding. "Dismiss these charges, restore these men's honor, and hold accountable the officer who used his badge as a weapon." For the first time in his career, Judge Denton looked uncertain. His jaw worked, but no words came. He saw the jury's faces, the reporters' pens, the gallery's eyes. He saw the general's stare. "Charges dismissed," he said at last, the words heavy, reluctant. The bailiff moved, not toward Marcus or Daniel, but toward Whitaker. "Officer Brad Whitaker," the sheriff's deputy announced. "You're under arrest. Step forward." The room held its breath. Whitaker stammered, "You can't. This is a mistake." The deputy snapped the cuffs shut. Cold steel, loud and final. The same sound Marcus and Daniel had carried on their wrists now clamped around Whitaker's. The same humiliation, flipped. The gallery erupted cheers, gasps, hands clapping despite Denton's futile gavel. Linda wept into Sophia's hair. Emily gripped Daniel's arm as if she might never let go. Marcus stood at last, no chains on his wrists, his shoulders rising to their full height. Daniel rose beside him, the burn scar on his arm catching the light, no longer hidden in shame. Whitaker struggled against the deputies, eyes wild, smirk gone. He was dragged past the jurors, past the Marines he'd tried to destroy. And for the first time, he walked in chains. The sound of the cuffs closing around Whitaker's wrists still echoed when the deputies hauled him through the doors. His protests faded down the hall, swallowed by the weight of what had just happened. The courtroom exhaled, as if it had been holding its breath for hours. Marcus and Daniel stood tall at the defense table, their chains removed at last. The gavel Denton clutched trembled faintly in his hand, but no one was looking at him anymore. All eyes were on the two men who had entered as defendants and now stood as Marines again. Linda was the first to move. She surged forward, her hands trembling as she reached for her sons. She kissed Marcus's cheek, then Daniel's, holding them as if they were boys again, back from school instead of from war and prison walls. Tears streaked her face, but her voice was steady when she said, "You held your heads high. I'm proud of you both." Sophia slipped past her grandmother's skirt and launched herself into Marcus's arms. "Daddy!" she cried, her small arms squeezing his neck. Marcus held her close, eyes closing, the world narrowing to the smell of her hair and the sound of her voice. Daniel felt Emily's hand slip into his. She looked up at him, eyes shining but fierce. "Told you I'd wait," she whispered. He pulled her close, no words needed. The jurors rose one by one, not waiting for instruction. A murmur grew, then a standing wave of respect. Even the bailiff's chin lifted, pride softening the lines of his face. General Caldwell stepped forward, his boots steady, his gaze fixed on the two men he had come to defend. He stopped just short of them, shoulders squared, medals catching the light. Then he raised his hand in salute. Marcus and Daniel straightened instinctively, their own hands snapping up, the motion crisp, precise, filled with everything that had been stolen and now returned. The salute held, silent and unshakable, until the weight of it brought the entire room to its feet. The silence wasn't empty, it was reverent. When Caldwell finally lowered his hand, his voice carried not just to the courtroom but to every heart in it. They risked their lives for freedom overseas. Today, freedom risked something for them. The words hung heavy, not as rhetoric but as truth carved into stone. Marcus kissed his daughter's forehead. Daniel clasped his mother's hand. Emily rested her head against his shoulder. The chains were gone, but the memory of them would never fade. And yet, as the doors swung open and sunlight poured in from the courthouse steps, it felt less like an ending and more like a beginning, a reminder that honor, once buried, can rise again. The gallery erupted, not in noise but in tears, in embraces, in the quiet awe of justice finally standing at attention. And for the first time since the night under the gas station neon, the Hill brothers walked free. They risked their lives for freedom overseas. Today, justice risked something for them. Share this video so more people see that courage deserves respect, not chains. Thank for watching.